What's good, everybody? Welcome to a video on the pathways that are used to combat aging. Now, this is the second video in the series discussing David Sinclair's longevity research. I'm going to try and be succinct with this about the biochemistry of the three pathways used to combat aging. These three pathways are the AMPK, the mTOR, and the sirtuin. And you can see the AMPK and the sirtuin pathway need to be increased to combat aging, and the mTOR pathway needs to be decreased. So the AMPK pathway is used to sense low energy levels via AMP and stimulate an increase in mitochondria to compensate. So you can understand that if there is an increase in mitochondria, there will be an increase in the amount of glucose that you convert into ATP, which is the energy of the organism. If you have more ATP, you can go through more cellular processes, have a healthier immune system, prevent DNA damage, and ultimately live a longer lifespan. So AMPK is named AMPK because it stands for AMP kinase, meaning that it senses low energy levels as AMP in the cell, and AMP indicates low energy levels within a cell because ATP is called adenosine triphosphate, which is the energy currency of the body. And then if it donates one phosphate group to another molecule, then it becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate, meaning it has two phosphate groups. Finally, if that is donated, it becomes AMP, adenosine monophosphate, meaning it only has one phosphate group left. So if there's a lot of AMP present within a cell or within a mitochondria, that would indicate that most of the ATP in the cell has been used up and you're kind of out of energy. So in high concentrations of AMP will stimulate the AMPK, which will phosphorylate PGC1 alpha. This PGC1 alpha will activate NRF1, which stands for nuclear respiratory factor 1. That nuclear respiratory factor 1 will stimulate TFAM, which is transcription factor A in mitochondria. And finally, that transcription factor A will actually bind to the mitochondrial DNA in order to produce, transcribe, and translate new mitochondrial proteins and ultimately create more mitochondria. And once again, if you have a bunch of mitochondria, you can create more energy and generally have a healthier cells and healthier body. Now I've put this other diagram on the left here just to give you an idea of various other processes that can stimulate PGC1 alpha and then NRF1 and have the downstream effects of mitochondrial biogenesis. You might recognize some of these. They're the nitric oxide pathway, resveratrol, exercise. So this isn't the only pathway, but it is the predominant pathway that stimulates mitochondrial biogenesis. Another thing that I wanted to add that isn't directly related to the AMPK pathway but does have to deal with mitochondria is just the idea that a low amount of inflammation can also help to create more mitochondria and create a more resilient organism. But in a high inflammatory environment, you actually will be detrimental to the organism. So you can see the graph here. If you have just a little bit of reactive oxygen species exposure from mitochondria, you'll actually have less mortality events, meaning less a lower chance of dying. And then if you get beyond that into higher levels of reactive oxygen species exposure, you have a greater chance of dying. And the reason for this is that you want just a little bit of reactive oxygen species. It's kind of like that saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger. So a little bit of stress will actually help to, those reactive oxygen species will help to stimulate not only that NRF pathway we talked about, which will help to stimulate mitochondrial biogenesis, but some other pathways that can ultimately result in antioxidant enzymes, heat shock proteins that can help to refold misfolded proteins, phase 1 and 2 detoxifying enzymes, all things that can definitely help to increase lifespan long term. Moving on, we have the mTOR pathway, which is actually the one that you want to decrease. Now, most people know the mTOR pathway is the one that is stimulated by any kind of food consumption or nutrient consumption, but in particular by protein and amino acid consumption. So this is a beneficial pathway in that when mTOR is stimulated, it's able to increase the protein synthesis of muscle protein and create any other proteins that the cell may need to grow and function properly. However, when this mTOR pathway is constantly being stimulated, you can see that it also inhibits various autophagy-related complexes. So autophagy is very important because it's able to get rid of cells that are not functioning properly, some of those senescent cells that we talked about during the aging process video, as well as it can get rid of or refold misfolded proteins that can also damage cells. So autophagy is really a very important process. The last pathway is the sirtuin pathway, which you would like to increase in order to increase lifespan. Now, this is primarily a histone deacetylase. We talked about how DNA is actually kind of sorted within the cell in the previous video, but you can see down here a little bit of a diagram of what happens. So you have a string of DNA that's wrapping around these little balls, and these little balls are proteins called histones. So the DNA kind of wraps around those histones, and then in turn, those histones are wrapped up into coils and supercoils and ultimately wrapped up into chromosomes. And these histones are important because the histones are modified by various compounds, which will allow them to either kind of open up and uncurl so the DNA within them that is wrapped around them can be read, or compacted back into the chromosome so they won't be able to be read. Now, normally, if an acetyl group is added to this histone protein, then it will open up so the DNA can be read. Whereas if a methyl group is added to the histone, then the DNA will be compacted so that it can't be read. Now, because the sirtuin pathway is a histone deacetylase, that means it actually removes an acetyl group from the histone, which will compact the DNA so that it can't be read inappropriately. Which is important because, as mentioned in the previous video, this unspooling of the DNA is a lot of times what can end up in inappropriate protein expression and ultimately the creation of senescent cells, zombie cells that can damage other cells within the body. Now, the sirtuin pathway is activated by the NAD molecule. NAD is another molecule that's very similar to ATP in that it is able to very easily pass electrons along. So high NAD levels generally are created by high energy creation or ATP creation within mitochondria. So if you have high ATP, generally you will also have high NAD, which will activate the sirtuin complex and close up that, compact the DNA and the histones into the chromosome so that it won't be read inappropriately, and ultimately it will help you to live a longer lifespan. Now, I tried to go somewhat in depth, but it's important to realize that there is a ton of crossover in all biochemical pathways within the body. And you can kind of see just an example of how each of these three pathways intersect with one another. And there are also many other pathways that intersect as well. But I wanted to give you a good idea of the main ones that interact and the main things that stimulate them. So thank you for watching. In the final video, the third video in the series, I'll just be talking about the various things that you can do in your everyday life to stimulate these pathways and to live a longer, healthier life. Thank you.